In this video, I'm going to be going over concepts related to short fiction. So let's turn to Canvas. Okay, so what I'm going to be lecturing on is this PowerPoint on fiction and terms, so you can refer to it. It's in the week 6 module if you want. So there's several types of fiction. There's flash fiction. This is really short. It's usually sometimes even less than half a page to a page long. It's just a super short story, and everything is really condensed. All the meaning is there. You have to really unpack it. It's kind of like some of the shorter poetry we've been reading. There's also just generally short stories, usually between 2,000 and 6,000 words. They contain rounded characters as well as flat characters. Rounded means exactly what it sounds like. Someone that is, complex. They're both simple and interesting. They are both good and bad. They just have dynamic personalities. And then there's flat characters who are really just there to like fill in space. They might be there to create a conflict, but you don't really know much about them, right? Like, so maybe there's a story about someone that has an affair. So the person that they had said affair with may not be really explored, but the person that had the affair that was the main character might have more fleshed out. But they were there to create, some sort of a conflict. And then there's novellas. So these are usually 50 to 150 pages. They're halfway between a story and a novel. We are going to read one later on in the unit. And then there's novels. These are what you're used to reading in as far as stories, like a book. And there's no specific length. They can be anywhere between 50 pages to 1,000 pages. It really goes throughout the gamut. And they have a mix of flat and rounded characters. So as we're writing about fiction, especially in your reading responses and as we start to get into essays, you really want to use terms. And I'm going to explain what some of these mean. So setting is more than just the place. You also want to think about the culture at the time. You want to think about the time period. You want to think about the era. You want to think about, more than just, a city. So for example, when we were thinking about The Wasteland versus Howl, right? That's a completely different time period, different eras. You're dealing with different settings. One is a rural, like countryside area. The other one is a city. And so, like, for example, the story of New York today might be very different from New York, at the birth of the city. So you want to think about culturally what could be going on at the time frame of when the story was written to kind of help you unveil meaning. Tone is basically, the attitude towards life, towards the subject in which it's being discussed. So is the narrator optimistic? Are they pessimistic? Are they indifferent? Do they not care at all? Are they nihilistic? So really thinking about like the tone. And this relates well to poetry as well. So you should have some familiarity with this. Point of view is really interesting with stories. As I told you, like when we're reading poems, you never want to assume that the author is the subject. The same thing with short stories. Sometimes the writer is it's confessional short story. I will tell you when that's happening, but it's not always the case. And you want to think about points of view. So omniscient is one of the most used ones, and it's sort of interesting. You want to think of it as kind of a godlike figure that can hear everything that's going on with all characters in the story. So the narrator may be, again, a godlike figure that reports on what everybody in the story is thinking and doing. They're all seeing, and you can really take their perspective to heart because they have all different perspectives within the one that they're presenting you. Interesting is first-person perspective. You're used to this as well. It's usually, the protagonist telling the story from their perspective. And what I think is interesting is to think about whether or not that is a trustworthy perspective. So you're only getting one side of a story. And so that can be really interesting when you think about other characters in the story that aren't giving you their perspective and you're just getting the perspective of one person. It kind of makes you question what it is that they're seeing and saying. So that can be kind of fun. And then there's the objective point of view, which doesn't happen often, but it's not an all-seeing character, but they report on what different people are thinking at different times. And it moves toward like between characters all the time. Doesn't happen very often, but it's interesting when it does. Foreshadowing is really important. So think of this as like kind of not just setting a tone, but like a prediction of things to come. So think about in The Wasteland, when it talks about the lack of water, right? The dryness, the infertility, and then at the very end you get rain, right? Like, so you think about like For example, in a story, maybe they're talking about a storm coming, and that could be foreshadowing for conflict ahead, right? Or you've got a character who's dealing with a crisis in their life, and there's things that are being pointed to which are going to lead to the bigger kind of conflict that's going to follow. So always look out for foreshadowing. Interior monologue, that's really what's going on within the characters themselves, so their inner thoughts. And that relates really well to stream of consciousness. So stream of consciousness is like the poem Howl. It's really someone's thoughts. They can be erratic, they can be chaotic, they can be dreamlike. We'll talk about that more as we read. Irony is a huge thing, and I really like to tell people, like, think about, if you haven't heard it yet, the Alanis Morissette song, Isn't That Ironic? Where she talks about like rain on your wedding day, or like getting really good advice when it's too late. So it's so tragic that it's funny. Like it's just almost impossible, right? And so that's how I like to look at irony, is it's something that's sort of humorous because it's so tragic. Climax is interesting. So that's like the moment of truth. It's kind of like the turn in a poem. It's the solution. So you've got this big kind of buildup of tension, and then it releases, right? And so that's really important to take note of in a story. And then resolution would be, the ending after the turn. Here's some questions you can ask about plot to kind of help you figure out what the plot might be of a story. That's really kind of the unfolding of the narrative. Like, what is the story being told, right? That's the plot. It could be someone's life. It could be just generally what's stuff that's going on. Sometimes there's no plot. Sometimes it's just literally the internal and external conflicts. So when I talk about internal versus external, an internal conflict is kind of thinking about what the character's talking about inside of them, their internal kind of struggles that they're dealing with. So, for example, in Howl, you've got Ginsberg dealing with internal struggles of his generation, right? Like feelings of loss, feelings of helplessness, feelings of anxiety, depression. And then you've got external conflicts, and those are things that aren't really brought on by you. It's really like the culture or the time or the politics. So for example, in one of the stories you're going to read, there is a young man who is a Dominican Republic immigrant in America. He's dealing with assimilation, he's dealing with poverty, he's dealing with street life. He's also dealing with his own sexuality. And so those are internal conflicts, but they're also complicated by the external. So for example, it takes place in the 80s. So the 80s was kind of a conservative time, right? And it was also kind of an anti-immigrant time, as it is now. So he's dealing with that as an immigrant. He's also dealing with his sexuality, which is a problem in the 80s. So all those things kind of add up. Then you've got protagonist versus the antagonist. So protagonist is usually the person in the story that's the main character. And the antagonist is usually the bad guy, right? The other person. Now, what's interesting in this is sometimes this can flip. So sometimes the protagonist may not be the person that you root for, but you might root for the antagonist. So like, for example, the Joker movies from Batman, right? Like some people really connect with the Joker character and they actually want to see him succeed. And some people don't want to see Batman succeed for various reasons. So as we get more modern in fiction, these kinds of traditional ways of presenting characters becomes more complicated. And it's really, really fun. So here's some questions you can ask about plot. I'm not going to go over all of them. Again, characters, flat versus rounded. You want to think about like simple flat characters are really the stereotypical characters, right? Like the stereotypical housewife, the stereotypical, businessman, or the stereotypical, adolescent, teenager, or the stereotypical middle-aged person that's having a midlife crisis. These are kind of flat characters that can become more complicated if they work through their issues. The anti-hero is a really interesting figure. Like, again, thinking about superheroes, right? You've got a character like Superman, right? Clark Kent, who's really just an average guy, doesn't look like he's anything, but then he's like Superman, right? And so it gives people who are really unglamorous and normal and ordinary a chance to shine in a story. And so that's really fun when that happens too. So here's some questions you can ask about characters and characterization. Theme is really important as well. So you want to think about, like, you could sum up the theme in a word or a phrase, but there's also deeper levels to theme, as we've talked about with existentialism, which is the theme of this course. Big questions about the human condition, ethical questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Is there a God? Is there meaning? Like, all of these questions are big themes in all of these stories that I've picked. And so here's some questions you can ask about themes. And then you are familiar with symbolism from working with poetry. So hopefully this will help translate into short story. But basically it's something that has a deeper meaning than just what it is, like a sun or a door or a storm, right? And here's some questions you can ask about symbolism as well. All right. Okay, so that's it for an intro to fiction and terms. If you guys have questions, please ask. Thank you.